There we go. We're recording now.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Noble Kelly. I'm the president and founder of Education Beyond Borders, and I'm very pleased to be presenting here at the Inter-University Conference on Education. I understand the theme this year is about accessibility to education, and what I would add is that let's talk about accessibility to quality education, and I'll get into that a bit through my presentation. First of all, a little bit about Education Beyond Borders. I'll call it EBB for short. Education Beyond Borders is a volunteer group, 100% volunteer run. It's got started through my travels around the world, working with disadvantaged youth, and also gone to meet their teachers. And what I found through these experiences that many teachers around the world in emerging countries often don't get professional development. So access to educational best practices that we in the global north really have great access to. So my thought was, why not have teachers share not only our resources, but this wealth of professional development that we often get. And so I created this organization, Education Beyond Borders, and it's teachers working with teachers in these emerging countries on a trainer-to-train-the-trainer basis. So we work at creating a set of peer-led and augmented workshops that will eventually be owned within 4 to 5 years by the local teachers. So we create teacher leaders who will be trained as trainers and facilitators of methodologies. So not what to teach, but how to teach, how to engage learners so that quality education happens. So trying to move away, because what we see often in many of these countries is that teachers will teach how they were taught, and that was through very rote memorization for exams. It's a very lecture method, so very teacher-centered. And so what we're trying to do with methodologies like project-based learning, differentiated instruction, collaborative learning, inquiry-based approach is to really make education interactive for learners. And so hence really supporting quality education. So there's a strong movement amongst all teachers globally that it's not enough just to have access or education for all, but it needs to be quality education for all. And how do we access that? So that's a little bit about our organization. And we worked in Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, Ethiopia. We're on set to go to try and work in Honduras as well. So, and that's kind of how we try to address this question about how do we access quality education. And it's not about, for us, it's not about building schools and given textbooks and things like that, because beyond that, the schools never taught the child. It's all about the teacher, and many people seem to forget about about supporting the teacher, and it's through that becomes more systemic change. It's more the longevity. It's more, I guess, for example, to put it in direct terms, when you support a teacher, and they have this capacity now to really engage the learner and really provide and deliver quality education, that teacher will directly impact every student they see from that point on. So when you consider that, on average, teachers in many of these emerging countries have class sizes of 50 students or more, you can really appreciate how many students are directly impacted by these positive changes. So for me right now, I kind of framed this discussion, this presentation is to look at, for us, what are some of the challenges and opportunities to improve this access to quality education? And then I'll like to talk a little bit about what is our role and what can we do and our accountability to make sure that we're doing our part, especially if we are not unable to reach many of the emerging countries ourselves personally. So through much of our work, I'm also an ICT, information communications and technology teacher, and I teach business at the secondary level as well. So most of my teaching subjects are very practical. And I train many teachers on the uses of technology. And many people want to really jump on the bandwagon that technology is the answer, the solution to really making education more accessible. But I'm going to challenge that for you a bit. What I see happening through my observations is that many governments or the decision makers that are pushing for technology are not educators. They're not the end users. And so what they try to do is oftentimes is replicate what's been done in the global north, so in our nations, for example, Canada. And so many of them are really spending huge amounts of money and huge investments on getting computer labs in many disadvantaged regions and schools. And my quick answer to many of them, and I try to get them to think ahead, is that if you're always aiming to replicate, you will always be behind. And what we found is that many of these countries are way ahead of us when it comes to ideas around, like, for example, mobile technologies. So with mobile technologies and predominantly the cell phone, how can we use cell phones? How can we use tablets in education? So I really push that we should move away from putting boxes, computers, and computer labs, smart boards, things like that. Those are huge investments that are really tied to one location, and look at more practical means. Equipment that will survive in these climates and these conditions, heat and dust, security issues. Really trying to go wireless as well, because there's huge security issues around even stealing things like copper wires and so on. So many of these investments beyond the equipment, many countries and education districts don't have the resources to follow up. They don't have the money for tech support, for repairs, for training and security and so on. So beyond the initial investment of putting the equipment or the computer in there, that's it. And so it becomes really a wasted investment. Also looking around, many people, there are things around mobiles for development and so on. So we've heard of, probably many of you have heard what are the latest developments and how mobile technology or mobile phones are used to really communicate with each other and share information. In education, it's a little bit different because of the huge amount of content. How do we really use cell phones to help collaborate and share and educate? So those would be the challenges in our area, especially in the field of education. One of the things that many people are looking at, well, the cell phones could be used for mobile testing and quizzes and things like that. And I think what we need to move away from is not to use these tools that people want to use because they're fun and because they want to use them for things that they don't like so much, like quizzes and tests, especially as students. So you're going to find you're creating processes for kids that become something they don't like to do. So we have to use the technology for something that it's intended to do, and that's to inspire and to explore and discover. And I think that's the important piece that we have to look at, is why we would use technology and the importance of using technology. So we really have to, for me, we kind of have to look at the idea, what is the future of education? Where is it going? Where is it moving? And so the education needs to be mobile. I mean, I think what we have to see how education is changing is that we need to create citizens that can communicate globally, that can collaborate globally, and that can create something. And I think those are the main areas, the main regions, I call it the 3 C's, that you really have to look at the power of education. So whatever tools and things that you look at is how can that support those? So first of all, again, looking at how we can use mobile technologies to move forward and look at the idea of communicating, collaborating, and creating. The next area that I see that the future of education is to be moved away from textbooks. Textbooks are prescribed. They're static. Many of them try to create online, have links and activities that make it more interactive, but it's still something that is prescribed. And you, as teachers, we need to be facilitators of learning. And I think where we start to see is that a lot of things are becoming more open source and moving away from static resources. So as educators, we have to look at our coursework and our content, but then how we can make it more interactive, how can it be flexible. We can take text-based, we can take video-based, we can take online simulations, we can do global discussions. We really need to make, audio. We really need to make our courses very interactive, and so by so doing, making it something that becomes more accessible. I think the main thing you have to look at is cost. For us, I mean, as you can see, even in our developed worlds, cost of post-secondary education is a huge issue. And you're seeing the effects of that in Montreal, but more importantly than that, in many of the emerging countries, because many students cannot go to post-secondary education. And so how can we look at removing the cost to education? So again, going open source materials, not being prey to sales, to the publishers for textbooks. I think they're starting to see that things are moving in that direction when it comes to textbooks, and creating a lot of online virtual textbooks that can be customized, but still with a cost. And I think the smart teacher will actually be the one that can create their own textbook. And why not have the students themselves create the content or the direction where they need to go? I think education is discovery. And so you don't need a textbook. You need someone who can understand the concepts, where you're starting and where you want to go, but how you get there, that is something for the learner to take and discover through being facilitated by their teacher. The other piece, internet access. Internet access, there's a cost associated with that. And I think until that becomes free, I think we're going to see a lot of accessibility issues. There is a huge movement towards making access to the internet a right and make that a free access for globally. I think many of the service providers are fearing that. This is a big money grab for them. And when you think about it, this is information, this is free information. So why should there be a cost associated with that? So, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying about taking away pay for phone and other data bundles and things like that, but things that you may use the phone for or packages, but access to the internet itself should be free, and or basic access to the internet should be free. And I think that's one of the issues that we look is a huge global issue for many of emerging countries when you look at things like that. But you can understand that the device that connects to the internet needs to be also something that's affordable and accessible to many. And so we are starting to see things like tablets and smartphones come down in price. Just so you understand, the service providers in many of the countries that we worked in, it is very cheap. There is no cost for anything incoming, so incoming international calls or is free. Just to put it give you a real example, for the month of July, while I was in Kenya, it cost me $10 to access the internet almost nonstop and have gigabytes of information downloaded and uploaded. So when you compare that to what we pay for that kind of service, you can understand why this is something that really needs to be globally standardized. So another thing, so when you're looking at the challenges, and it's many things that have the cost associated with that. Until we're able to alleviate that and have that accessibility, I think that that's the piece that's one of the main things. We are prey to the suppliers and the publishers. They are telling us what we need to have good quality education. Whether it's technology saying this is what you need in your classroom for technology, or the publisher saying this is the textbook you need that'll make your course exciting. It's commercially driven, so it becomes the suppliers that are driving the direction education is going, instead of the users, the clients, the students, and the teachers. So I think that is something we need to take on for ourselves as well. So I'm going to take a little bit of a pause. It's really hard to talk nonstop. And with no interaction. For me, it's about getting questions and answers. So just to kind of summarize that piece for us and looking at the challenges there, it's about no to computers, the boxes, but yes to the mobile technologies, and how to access that. How can we support teacher professional development, for example, and access to best practices in pedagogy or methodologies. No to static textbooks, but yes to more open source content and resources and flexibility on the variety of things that are used to educate. No to paid internet access. So looking at free models of access in basic internet. So no to cost, just to free. I think that's the main thing that we kind of want to look at when it comes to those kinds of things. What has always worked for us, as far as success in our programs, is building relationships. And I think, though technology improves access to people, to ideas, to content, nothing really beats that face-to-face. And I think for us as people who are advocates for education, when you create a relationship, you create a bond that is more lasting. And I think that has been the key to much of our success in developing programs that work with teachers and in this area. And whatever ways you can take to try and improve and create relationships. So I think, that whole issue around collaboration and reaching out to those that we tend not to reach out to because it isn't easy to do so. Maybe there's not the access. I think that's one of the important things. So that kind of segues me now into what is our role, what is our accountability in this. Many of you may be familiar with the term digital divide, and that is the idea that globally, because many do not have the access to technology or the internet or electricity, that they are getting further and further away from those of us that do. And one of the big things we look at around that is obviously our connectivity and accessibility to good high-speed connectivity. I remember threatening many of my students in their computer classes that if they weren't productively using their resources, I would send them back to dial-up. And you should hear. And I'm sure you can imagine that too. For those of you who were around in the days of dial-up, if you were forced to go back to dial-up instead of high-speed broadband wireless, you would just balk at that idea as well. So we are inadvertently contributing to this idea of a digital divide. For those of us who are connecting to others or collaborating to others, take a look at who it is that we are connecting to. Often you're going to find for the majority, and I know this is the case in many high schools and things like that, is that the haves are connecting to the haves. It's because it is easier to connect to those that have good access. Canada is connecting to people in the States, Australia, the UK. There's a language issue as well, but I think, for purpose of education and teachers who are trying to facilitate this collaboration between their classrooms and so on, the idea is, it's easier. I can't be, bothered by the low response time by trying to connect to a country that may not have stable connectivity. And that becomes a problem because we're creating a skewed or a more myopic global view, because if we are continuously connecting with the same people or the people that have maybe the same global perspective as ourselves, what is changing? I'm going to challenge to say that what is changing in that exchange? Not much. So how can we almost learn how to be patient in this aspect so that we can support the connection with those that may not have that stable connectivity? So that becomes the challenge, both on a personal level and on an infrastructure level. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at, trying to really challenge educators, is to, change your misconceptions about connectivity. They have there's a group of there was a school in the middle of Kenya that we were at. It's a Maasai culture, and they have mud schools, but they had a computer lab that was donated, a laptop in a container, ship container, that is solar powered, and they had the modem sticks to connect to their telecommunications, their mobile lines, and it's a great. They were getting 3G, so it was a great connection. So Skype is possible. They've got very stable cell phone connectivity. So we have to change the perception that we cannot connect to them. Obviously. Video has a huge bandwidth issue, and until there are ways to kind of get around that. They're starting to work on those issues. You can have the initial meet and greet, but via video, and then switch to audio and have questions and look at challenge to look at discussing about global issues, how it's interconnected with us, how do we see what's happening in the world manifest itself locally. I think you're starting to see some of that happening, especially around the fees for post-secondary education and things like that. You're starting to see things happening on a global scale around those kind of issues. So beyond that, looking at areas around gender and environment and politics and so on, to really look at how do we create education. I think one of the important pieces is that education is moving is to peer learning. Who are our peers, and how do we learn from each other? I think we have to change our first of all, our idea of the fact that, wow, we have lots to offer and maybe we can teach others. I think that's, well, I don't want to go so far, but it is an arrogant point of view, perspective. And we have to see what is it we can learn from others globally, especially those that we may feel that are in a disadvantaged area or region or emergent. How can we learn from them? And I think that was one of the big aha moments for many of the teachers that are in our programs from Canada that have gone initially thinking that they have lots to share and this is something they're going to feel good about. They end up finding that they had so much to learn, and bringing back that global perspective into their classrooms to enrich their classrooms. So quality education is about enrichment, expanding perspectives, making it more global. So that is one of the challenge. Okay, not connecting just to the haves. There is, that's important as well. But really challenging ourselves to go beyond our perspective and reaching out to others, even though it may not be easy. I think we really need to strive and challenge ourselves to try and do that. And I think one of the other, we don't even have to go so far to do that. We have to look locally as well. How much do we know about our Canadian North and the communities there? I think, there's a huge gap between our North and those along the 49th parallel. I think we need to really connect our universities, classrooms, our high schools, Skype with those communities and those schools and exchange ideas and talk about challenges and share more and learn from each other. So really address that issue about global collaboration, and even because Canada is such a huge country geographically, that we can consider ourselves becomes a global issue as well. So we really need to challenge ourselves about who we're connecting to. And so for us, I know I kind of mentioned a few things there. So the area around technology, looking at the digital divide and the use of technology, and how we can challenge ourselves and not contribute to that global digital divide. We need to look at how we can enrich our perspectives so it doesn't become very myopic, that we look at expanding our horizon, expanding our perspectives, learning, educate ourselves through peer learning. How do we work with our peers to learn from each other and with each other? I think we need to see about creating projects that that we are paired up with someone from another country on a certain topic, and look at moving more towards that. And then finally looking locally. I think the challenge is what the interconnectedness of the issues. How does that drought in East Africa, how's the drought in East Africa impact the rest of the world? How do the land grabs impact us? The big issues, in this global area, we're talking about things like many countries, because they've run out of usable land for agriculture and so on, use many of the land's being sold in many of these countries in Africa to be used for that. Yet the rewards from that do not stay or go to the local people. One case in point, a huge percentage of Europe's exotic flowers come from Kenya. And you will see huge greenhouses that suck up the local water and resources. Yes, they're providing employment. However, all the flowers get shipped out. It uses a huge amount of water and so on. The same thing with the agriculture. A lot of food is being shipped out to many countries, and much don't stay behind. I was very shook my head. I think you recall, when Iceland's volcano exploded and created a lot of halt in the air traffic. And one of the stories that came from Kenya was that because the flights were grounded, a lot of the food that was meant to be shipped out was rotting. And when you understand the amount of people that actually are starving in that country, that was acceptable, really makes you want to consider, look at this issue a little bit deeper. So how do we learn more about these issues? And it's about us taking the accountability to access this quality, this global perspective and this quality, and taking this on a personal level. So I think I covered quite a bit there, and it's really hard. I don't know, Kate, if you might have another question or something that I may address that I can add to, but I think I've covered a lot of the main points that I wanted to cover.
Yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate this. Sorry, I'm just going to put the video back on. There we go. Here I come. Don't want to distract from actually presenting. I guess I'll give you one question to kind of play off of. I don't want to give all of my questions away, because then Saturday will be really boring. But how would you? I'm a linguistics student, right? So I always am going to think about that language issue. How would you suggest bridging that language gap?
Great. I'm glad you said that. One of my one of the things that we are finding that is happening that I am totally against is that many countries are changing to English as the language of instruction. You're finding this in Latin American countries. You're finding this in many African countries. Some of them were Portuguese and now switched to English, and French switching to English. Many, because the decision to switch to English language instruction is monetarily based. It's about how do we compete on a commercial basis globally as a country. And what you're finding, that the huge problem with that is that as you may or may not know, to acquire another or learn another language, you have to have a good foundation in your mother tongue. You have to understand what grammar is, what sentence structure, how language is developed in your own mother tongue. And many of these students are forced to learn English at a very young age before they even grasp their own national or mother tongue language. And so what you're finding is that because the exams and the instruction is in English, many of them failed because of a language issue. And so the access to education is not within their control. And so what I'm hearing this from principals and teachers, that this big issue. So what their answer to that is, oh, can you train us English, how to teach English better, or teach us English better? And I'm like, that's the wrong solution. Why are you doing this in the first place? For us, we're not forced to be instructed in a language that is not our national mother tongue in Canada. And if we want another language, that's an option that we can do. But it's later on when we understand it, or it's in an environment for like an immersion environment where it's something that we have the practice and the capacity to do. Many of these students in these emerging countries do not. So language is becoming a big barrier to learning for many of them, because they are forced to learn in a language that they don't have any concept of, and are not taught how to learn it appropriately. So this is a real global issue that is having much debate. So for what I love is trying to learn other language, and the challenges of finding the patterns in language and understanding how those were designed. What we're finding as well is many cultures are trying to recapture their lost language and helping them to become, create an indigenous curriculum. For example, the Mayan culture in northern Guatemala, in northern Honduras, where we were near Guatemala, the Mayan language was never written down, and they're trying to create a textbook for preschool, for primary kids, how to count and basic letters and words in the Mayan language. And so they're trying to recapture that. And I'm hearing these kind of stories about indigenous curriculum trying to be created and saved and restored. And that's another point is how do we connect the indigenous stories? Because as through my travels, I am finding that these are the stories that educated the next generation, that are passed down from generation to generation. That's how they learn their science concept, through folklore and through stories. And how do we? And I'm finding patterns and morals of stories that are very similar from culture to culture. And it would be great that using technology that we can connect the cultures to share these stories. So using indigenous stories to educate, and how do we bring culture back into education is a huge issue, because it has usually been stripped away through colonialism and so on. When the education system were introduced, culture was stripped out and taken out of that, and it has so much to offer and so much, and has a strong foundation in education. So that language issue is going to be a big one for us. When we look at new languages being developed, the text language, for example, and other means of communicating. A generation will communicate. Your generation will communicate with the others because you have a similar language. texting is huge in Africa. They're a mobile culture. They know how to text and SMS. And I don't know if you know the statistics, but how many languages are dying on a monthly basis?
I think it's something like in the next 10 years it'll be down to 5,000 ish from our current 6.
Yeah, and when you think about that,
on that, but it's dying quickly.
That loss of culture, never mind language, and I think that's a big thing to kind of really, how do we preserve that, and how do we address that issue of language and looking at communication? So how can we communicate? And when I think on shared stories, if they have to be translated, they have to be translated. But what I found is peers connect beyond language. What interests teens in Ethiopia, interests teens in South Africa, interests teens in the UK, interests teens in Canada. It's about music. It's about sports. It's about clothing. It's about hobbies. Those are things people connect on because humans are social beings, and so you will find other ways to communicate beyond language. And I think that's the other challenge, is how do we try and do that through education. So that becomes a real accessibility issue too. If language becomes the barrier to quality education, how can we move beyond that? What do we have to do to move beyond that? And I think that's a very important piece and a good discussion question to have in small circles and extend to others and have that discussion on a global level.
So many more that I potentially have, but I really do want to save them for Saturday just in case we run out.
When we hear from the others as well.
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm looking forward. You can probably share it during when we hear from others as well.
Yeah.
Give us an opportunity. That'll be good. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna stop the call recording now.
I'm Finola. This is Finola. Hi, my name's Finola. First, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. You brought up a lot of really fascinating points and touched on a lot of different accessibility issues relevant globally. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask about what you mentioned regarding the move to open source sort of textbooks, if you will, like moving away from the traditional types of textbooks.
Right.
And what people always bring up concerns about validity of these sources. Like our professors won't let us cite Wikipedia, and do you think that there's a certain cost to be had in terms of the quality of the resource, and how can we move towards open source but yet make sure that these resources are also reliable and accurate?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, as an ICT teacher myself, we need to take the opportunity to talk about information literacy skills. Like what types of sources do we use for research? Where do we get our information? How accurate is that information? And rightly so, your professors will say, yes, well, Wikipedia, anybody can put information on there, and it's not necessarily accurate. But I think when we're looking at things like peer learning and peer adjudicating, where we have to really evaluate each other and hold each other up to the same standards. So I think Wikipedia, if there are errors up there, they usually get filtered, they get research, people will come and say, no, that's wrong, this is the right thing. So eventually, through all that kind of vetting process, most of the information does get accurate. So obviously we need to really understand the source, where the source of the information come, and really be savvy. Both, I think one of the most important skills we can learn is how to be media savvy or media literate, and talking about media issues. For me, the piece about open source and moving away from textbooks, I think it is a great disservice if we feel that we should get all our information from one source or one thing and say that is it. The best skill that teachers can teach any student, no matter how old they are, even adult learners, is the process of learning, the process of finding information and judging, because that is a learning process, how you judge your information and where you get your information up towards your learning. You know, we as teachers, we should be facilitators, almost like navigators. We provide students with maps. We say, here's where we are, here's where we want to go. How you get there is up to you. Some people will take the long route. Some will take a scenic route. Some will take a plane and get there really quickly. You know, so that's catering to the different learning styles as learners have. And I think if teachers can, you know, not throw out textbooks, you know, you as a teacher and as a learner understand the concepts, what needs to be taught, the main points. But how can we teach that in different ways? You know, video, can we interview someone? Can we go do some research, an experiment or whatever? So if we can mix up the content and not have it all prescribed from one textbook, and all this information, I think one of the things I see often in for example, in countries that I am in Africa, the salespeople are selling these packages of video DVDs to teach. And give it to, and say, here, this, you need to buy this. You need to have this signed contract for these many years. So you have these great video content pieces that you can share with your teachers and give them to help them, because we know they're lacking with the resources. But I'm like, why should they buy that? I mean, all that information. Give me one of those DVDs. I can find all that information online for free. I can find any of that for free. It's just that, yes, you are saving the people the time of having to go and look and find the things. And I think that becomes a judgment call. And that becomes one of the biggest issues for much of this for teachers, is the lack of time to prep or to find the information and do that kind of stuff. So I think, you know, there's going to be a balance. You know, yes, some easy stuff. Let's take textbook. Let's do this. But as much as we can integrate free open source materials, there's a huge movement towards open source. I think that will add to alleviate the accessibility issues. And I think teachers shouldn't be the bottleneck. We should allow students to, you know, we will adjudicate. We will say, yes, you are on the right track. Yes, that's great. We even may learn something from the path you took to find your solution, find your research. So I hope I covered a couple of those things there.
Actually, I have a question about financing projects, whether it be through distributing more mobile technology pieces or just sending people to be able to teach teachers how to teach. That was a lot of teaching. But do you think that organizations like yours that do some fundraising are sufficient, or do you think that there needs to be more support from governments of the countries that you're working in, governments of countries like the U.S., like the UK, et cetera? Is that...
Yeah. I think, you know, there's always, you know, that danger where those of us, or, you know, people in the global north feel that, you know, we have a lot to share, or we are doing it the right way, and this is what they need to do. And I think there's a danger there to a point where should it always be coming from somewhere else? And, you know, like it or not, politically, that international people coming to do some work is often the catalyst for change to happen. But that's where it needs to stop. I think when you're stuck in a system, and if you have to understand the system a bit, the education system has been really ingrained from the colonial days for many countries. And it is very hard for them to change their ways. And without input from an outside source, nothing will ever change. And that's why teachers will teach the way they've always been taught. And the system will stay the way it is unless there's input from outside source saying, well, here, look at these best practices. What do you think about these? And so on. So there is definitely that need for that catalyst for change. And I think having teachers or other global advocates for quality education to share information. So it may be a face-to-face thing at first, but like what we've done once we've developed the relationship and built and trained with ICT skills, many of those teachers are doing online conferences. There's a global education conference coming up in mid-November. Many of them have moved from not knowing anything to technology to last year they presented to their peers. And it was very exciting because many came to hear them because we very rarely hear their voice because of the accessibility issue to online networks and social networks. So I think there needs to be that catalyst, but that's where it needs to stop. We need to empower others to be able to say, yeah, we need to always be open to others' ideas. We need to learn and share with each other. And that speaks to that whole piece about that peer learning. No matter where we are whether we're educators, decision makers, policy makers, or students, we need to be learning from each other and not just within our little bubble. And I think, we're lucky in Canada because many of our little bubbles are very global in nature. They're in lots of international students and things like that. But there is learning to be had from that exchange. So as much as we can, that's the challenge I kind of mentioned, is we need to open up our perspectives and make sure we are challenging ourselves to have that dialogue and exchange with others from different perspectives all the time so that we are learning through that process.
Sure. I don't know if you can hear me very well, but you were talking earlier about a lot of the schools switching to English as a language of instruction, and sort of tying into the point where they shouldn't just be consumers of external content. Do you think, you talked about how it was not working quite well because of the lack of basis in the mother tongue, but in terms of a strategy, do you think that it's a good one? And I mean, it's not just in the areas that you talked about. I recently heard of a major university in Italy who has given a year warning and are switching all of their instruction into English, even for current students. And so it's happening all over the board, and I was just wondering sort of how you felt about that.
Yeah. Language should not be the barrier to learning. And when it becomes that, that's when it needs to change. That doesn't become the best solution. And I think learning language is part of learning. At the university level, I'm going to maybe presume that there has been enough English introduction through life and through other means that transition might not be as difficult as it would be at the elementary level. And I think that's where the biggest issue is you need to have good language foundation skills so that it doesn't become a barrier to learning. And whatever the language of instruction be, I think that's it. You always have to look at who is your clientele, who's the learning for. And if you're looking at students, in many African nations, you're looking at a rural population, a rural society, and their language. And so if you force them to learn in a language that they very rarely have practice with, or it's not part of their living, it's not a part of their lifestyle, it's not part of their economy, it's not part of whatever. I can't tell you how many times we go to many of these rural areas and the only English we hear is, how are you, how are you, how are you? That's the first main thing they learn to speak with to tourists, but that's the only thing they ever say in English because that's the only exchange they ever have. So they're not really learning the language properly, or they're not really learning the language. So are you really doing a disservice because it's becoming a barrier to learning? Because if it forces them not to learn the concept, and I think that was one of the things I would love to see more principals test and retest students, is that we see, like, for example, from grade 10 through grade 9 through 12, across the board in many rural communities, their marks just fall, they just plummet, and the question is, they said it's because of this English language acquisition. And I said, well, have you also retested some of them randomly in their own mother tongue to see if it's a knowledge issue or a language issue? And that becomes the thing. Did they understand the concept as it was taught to them in English? Or did they just, because of the language, they never understood the concept either? So it's those kind of things that if they cannot express, because their tests are in English too. So if they can't express themselves properly in the language of instruction, maybe they understand it and you understand the concept. But when it comes to, it's a very exam-driven education system, then it becomes a problem. Much of their marks, believe it or not, across the board from grade 2 to 12, almost 100% of their market, for example, in Kenya, is from their final exam for each grade. So that's why it's so geared to exams, and it becomes their mark just dropped. So for me, I really would love to preserve culture. I would love to preserve language and learning in that language. But we all know that if we can open up to learn other languages, however and when we're ready to learn them, I think you will learn them better. I think every student said if they were forced to learn something, no matter what it was, they're less likely to learn it until they're ready to learn it. So I think that becomes also an issue too.
I don't know if you could hear that, but there was like a collective gasp when you said that in Kenya, 50% of a grade is based on a final exam. For 100%. Some classes at McGill, it's like that, but that's excessive. Like, how do you feel about that kind of exam-driven learning paradigm? I'm assuming it's a negative.
It's hugely negative. The teachers know that, but their hands are tied. They're forced to teach to an exam. And when you know your marks 100% and you want your students to pass and your school is judged on your results only, you will have to, you're teaching to an exam. So you're helping your students memorize. And that's all they need to do is to memorize, because they want to move on and they want to pass because they need to. Many of them, but the biggest thing is there is no teaching beyond the exam. And that becomes a huge problem when you're not creating a society that can critically think and become an economic source to help support development of the community or the country. And I think that becomes a big issue, a really big issue. Even here, we're trying to move away from exams. In high schools here in BC, the only mandatory exam is the basic English exam. So universities have an accountability to also say, do we need to force to accept so many exams for entrance requirements? So the universities themselves here have required only the English exam. Obviously, there's other things that are involved and things like that. So it still hasn't been a good, complete transition to that attitude. But I think that's where it needs to head to. But yeah, their exams 100%. When you know you're that pressured to pass an exam, you'll do anything to do that, and that means cram and memorize. So you're not really learning, and that becomes, especially if it's in a different language, you're trying to memorize how words are spelled and what words to use and things like that instead of understanding what those words are. So yeah, it is a huge issue, and many of them know we need to move away from that kind of standardization and move away from exam-based.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe? Anybody?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi. I really liked... Sorry.
Go ahead.
Back when we were talking about global accessibility to internet, I thought it was a really intriguing idea about making internet access free. But in terms of the current reality in a lot of places and how corporations have such monopoly on internet access, I was just wondering, what your thoughts were as to get the ball rolling towards that.
Yeah, I think that kind of stuff is market driven. So if the market is willing to pay for a service, then the suppliers will charge that price for that service. So we in North America are willing to pay what it takes so that we have connectivity. And as long as there is restrictions on competition, there's always going to be that issue. And I think we're starting in Canada, for example, we're starting to see more cell phone providers starting to open up and get into the business and things like that. In many of these African nations, because the population cannot pay, their price structure is based on what they're able to pay and what the society is able to pay. So you're finding that it is very much more cost effective and very cheap for cell phone and to internet access. That's their livelihood. The cell phone is their communication system. It's their computer. It's their network, and that's it. The cell phone is it for them because of the great distances and things like that. I don't have the link handy, but I'll send it to Kate, and maybe she'll pass it on to you, to various movements towards free internet access, free internet providers, and it is coming the accountability of the service providers for that, to say how can you structure something within your bundles or whatever so that basic internet access, maybe for so many kilobytes or maybe 2 gigs per month, is up to that point is free. Anything above that you'll have to pay, so that you are forcing, you're allowing those that need it that access to the internet, which should be a right, because it is information. It's like you shouldn't have to pay to learn something. You are, but you shouldn't have to pay to have to access to the internet. And that's why many of us like, oh wow, look, free Wi-Fi. So why can we have free Wi-Fi here but still have to pay for it at home? And we can go to a coffee shop and have free Wi-Fi. That doesn't make sense. So why can't it just be free? There are certain cities have moved to the Wi-Fi accessibility that's citywide. Airports have started to get on the bandwagon and have free Wi-Fi available. So, you're going to see free Wi-Fi. You're going to see free internet access. Obviously, it's going to be limited, which is fine. But I think that's how they should scale it, so that it's free for basic access and use. And then above that, yeah, sure, you can go ahead and charge, because it is a drain on the resources. But that's where it should be, and that's what I think it's going to go. That's where it's headed.
Last ones.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I really do appreciate it.
No problem. Well, maybe I can hear from you guys something quick.
Sorry?
Can I hear? Maybe I can ask you guys a question.
Yeah.
I'll put you on this. So, prospectively, I think for your age group in universities, what do you see as far as your biggest barrier to access for education, and what do you see, for your peer group? What may be a solution, or what can be something that you can do that will help maybe us connect you to others in your peer group to support access to education?
Well, I know that a lot of the discussion today, it seems, from start to finish, revolved around finances, revolved around, is university too expensive? Even if it gets cheaper, people still might not be able to pay for it. The financial aid systems are broken. It seems like finances is a major concern, but if anyone else disagrees or has another idea, jump in.
Well, a barrier to actual learning,
Yeah.
at least in the first 2 years here at McGill, is definitely class size, because you can go through a whole semester without ever speaking to your prof in person. So I'd say that's a big barrier to actual learning once you're in university. And I guess to move past that, they could put in, well, the best solution would be just to make smaller classes.
Yeah.
But so far they have tutorials, but I mean they're not as good as just having individual attention with your teachers. So.
Also the system of testing that comes
Yeah.
with huge class sizes, especially first 2 years of science, students just basically can get by and get good grades through memorization, writing Scantron exams, and then they get to third year where they have smaller class sizes
Yeah.
and they actually have to think, and I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, so you've all kind of reiterated the same issues that are at all levels of this food problem in many of these emerging countries too. The assessment system is broken, the huge class sizes, and cost as an inhibitor to reaching where you go. Many of those students may get the marks moved to high school or to post-secondary, but they don't have the financial capacity to do so, and so they don't. Many families, when they have large families, will send the boys to school and not the girls, and so on. So, or you have to pick who of your sons or daughters are going to go to school, and things like that because of the cost factor. So cost, is a big issue. So I think you hit a nail on the head there. How can we alleviate the cost? I know obviously things cost to do it, but if the resources themselves were free, if we didn't have to pay for the textbooks, if we did not have to pay for the infrastructure, the internet access, and things like that, that would reduce the cost of entrance into whatever institution. And it's never been the building that's ever taught anyone, whether it's a school or a university or whatever. It's the teachers, and how the teachers can reach all the students. And I think that whole, the thing that we do is teach the teachers how to create collaborative learning structures within their classrooms. So, you probably get more interaction and learning from if you are working in smaller groups to discuss and critically think topics and so on. That exchange is a great learning process. And more classes should be structured like that instead of the lecture method where you have one person and 100 people listening, right? There's very little interaction and dynamic in that process. It does need to happen, but, it should be limited to the way it happens. So how teachers teach needs to be changed around as well. I think that's the thing. But how can you take it on yourselves as students to say, where is my learning coming from? Is it just here from this one teacher in this classroom, or how are we being allowed to connect to others on the same topic? In your field of study, when you get to third year and stuff, it's always the practicum, the practical, the experiential, the really hands-on stuff that you really learn the most through. And how can you do that in the earlier years too? How can that be more integrated in your coursework? And can you take it upon yourselves to do that as well? As part of whatever assignment or project you're given, can we do that? Can we make sure that we are? Oh wow, it might be good to actually talk, to people who are actually living this thing firsthand. How can I connect to these people? How can we learn from each other? And how can we share that? Because one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of connect university students with their peers in these emerging countries as we are connected, so that dialogue can happen and you can mentor and also help back and forth that way too. So, there are no quick answers. The system needs to change both from the bottom up and the top down. But I think as much as you're seeing the movement to really understand your own accountability and your role in learning, and how learning should happen, I think if you start asking for that, and for assignments or projects that allow you to interact with others, not just in your classroom, but maybe across Canada or across this planet, I think then you're going to see some really dynamic learning happening for all sides. So,
Yay.
Great. So thanks so much.
We really do appreciate it.
No problem.
I will be in touch with you about the links that you mentioned, as well as the donation I talked to you about earlier.
Sure.
But otherwise, I think we're good. I'll email you about that later.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you so much again.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice rest of the weekend.
Too.